Usually, like with a story, with a movie, you have a very set story sequence and you can't decide anything to change it. That's a general narrative structure. However, with branching narrative, there's different types of branching narrative. This is String of Pearls map. This is a common one where you have a main storyline that your decisions don't really change the outcome of the story. But then you also have side quests that go off into their own branches that you can do as well. And a lot of games have that. That's probably the simplest type of branching narrative out there. And then there are other types of branching narrative. And I would say that a lot of games have a mix of these things in them. Final Fantasy XIV has something kind of like this, where you have a starting point, everyone starts at the exact same spot, but then depending on what decision you have made as your starting class, you start in a different place. And then you have a branching story for that place, and then at some point it converges into the same place again. And then sometimes it'll branch off again, and then it'll finally come onto this ultimate branch that is the main story. And then it comes into more of something like this, String of Pearls. It depends on the game. It's not like one game is one of these types and that's it. So it's more complex than what they've drawn here. Another one, like Undertale, is this type of map of many endings where you start at the same place, but then depending on your decisions that you make, you could have a completely different outcome of the game. Persona 5 can have some effects like this. The overall main story is the same, but your decisions do change the outcome of who's still there at the end of the story, who are your friends, who are your foes, and so forth. And this isn't just for games. This is also for serious games like training. And that's where my experience is, branching narrative with training, because in training, the more effective training in VR has different consequences depending on your decisions. And so that is what branching narrative is. And so even if you are in this for serious applications, training, therapy, whatever, branching narrative is going to benefit you because it's going to help you create a more compelling training or experience, whatever it is that you're trying to do. So it's not just for gaming. So don't just write it off because we're talking about games, because this very much, and I learned that very early on in my switching over to XR design, was games have a very direct impact on any immersive experiences that we create, including XR, like application design, because there's a different type of interaction and mindset that is with this type of hardware. So we need to adjust and learn from that. Genshin Impact, the main story of Genshin Impact, the main game is like this, the String of Pearls, where it's just the main story and you can't really change it. Then it's got branching side quests. But if you do some of these, there's called daily side quests. And if you do enough of these daily side quests, you unlock other quests that are what we're doing. They're called hangouts. And these are the mini endings branch is what we're working on with Genshin Impact. There's a difference in narrative and dialogue, branching narrative and branching dialogue. And I mentioned that as well in other videos. But basically the difference in the branching narrative and the branching dialogue is the narrative's the whole story. Dialogue is just little conversations, and you could choose your response to those conversations. They may or may not affect the outcome of the whole thing. But there are design patterns in here. You see that he is standing here in a neutral posture waiting for a response to his conversation. The body language and rigging of this model it's looking at whoever he's talking to. So he's looking at that person. He's in a neutral posture. He's still breathing. Still looks natural. That absolutely matters for XR. Your NPC rigging matters even more so in XR than it does in 2D, on 2D games, because it's in real life size, and what you would not expect. And I learned this almost immediately when I got my first project with branching dialogue, branching narrative in training, for training with consequences. And it had NPCs that talked to me as the player. Their body language, their behavior, when they're talking, when they're interacting in XR is very important, because if it's off, even slightly, you're going to notice it a lot more in XR because it's life size. You're immersed in that experience. and it feels a lot more real than 2D. So you're going to notice all that stuff that's wrong. And so paying attention to the rigging, paying attention to the body language, the behavior, the tone in XR matters a lot. Best case scenario, it just breaks your immersion. Worst case, it makes you feel demeaned or ignored or some kind of negative emotional effect on you, which you don't want, unless that's the point of the training. And then in the actual UI, you see his name, what he does. Mada is the storyteller, and you can read what he just said. And you can do this regardless of what language. I play it in Japanese, and there is stuff that get lost in translation, which is important in how you translate your dialogue into other languages, because things do get lost in translation when you don't do it effectively. Then you'll see underneath the words this little diamond that has this little floating triangle in it. That little diamond is to indicate dialogue is done and we're ready to continue. But it's letting me manually progress by default. There is an option to start autoplay here. Some people want autoplay. They want to just sit back and enjoy the story. I prefer manual progression, and a lot of people do prefer manual progression because we all read and comprehend at different speeds, and there are external things in the world that can distract us from whatever it is that we're paying attention to. And this is very important for training, is you need to be able to manually progress so that they can comprehend what it is that they're ingesting, training or therapy or whatever. Manually progress it so that they can comprehend at their own pace. Different languages, distractions, all kinds of things can slow down comprehension. So we want to make sure that we give them the option. There are things that are going to distract you. And when you don't have the option for manual progression, you're going to miss important details. And that is very important and detrimental to training, especially if you're in a classroom setting for training, education. You definitely want manual progression at that point. So these design patterns do matter, and I've experienced this and noticed this myself whenever designing these for VR, that it still does matter. All of these little details matter. That's why I'm saying game to enhance your XR experience, because those micro interactions are expected and they matter. Game designers have figured this out. They've done their research and they know this works, and there's a reason that it continues to be a pattern in here. Sometimes there are bad patterns that continue that aren't effective. They're just copying other people, but this pattern for the branching dialogue, for the little dialogue boxes, is important and expected. So if you're doing dialogue boxes in XR, then you want to follow that pattern of those micro interactions. Game design has already solved a lot of these problems that we can use for XR.